Jim, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. James was never an exciting person to begin with. Adding more than one flavor of syrup to his half-priced happy hour Sonic Drive-In Dr. Pepper was about as wild as he ever got. In high school, he made moderately good grades. Thought he rebelled when he put blonde highlights in his mousy brown hair, and only narrowly escaped beatings from football and lacrosse players on nearly a daily basis, partly thanks to the one club and mentor that gave him refuge, French Club, under the tutelage and guidance of Madame Bussen. Day after day, James would slip into Madame B's, as her room was affectionately called by her students and the cooler staff. His love for the French language grew, chiefly due to a strange cocktail of gratitude to Madame B and to the sheer immensity of her epic bosoms. The air conditioning in room 213C always allowed for 2 targets at which James could toss his increasingly adept irregular verb conjugations and recollection of vocabulary. Graduation ended James's time with Madame Bussen and her mounds, but his association of French with sex and safety was not to be severed. Because James was so average, he was only accepted to 2 schools. One minor joke of a university in Alabama, and another slightly less minor joke of a university in his native Arkansas. He chose the latter. Though the jokes of derision from his family would come, they would come with less frequency with this decision. One cannot live Alabama down. Professor Lucius was younger and fitter than Madame Bussen had been, and the former also had a thick southern drawl, which she could miraculously turn off in favor of an impossibly beautiful, perfect approach to the French she taught. Supposedly, she had left her husband to run away on a Parisian tryst, but this was all hearsay, and besides, she had a huge rock on her finger that did not sing any songs of a woman cuckolding her man. Her gleaming auburn hair was a wonder to behold as well. It would spill over James's flawless translations as she would lean over to put her face inches from his to give him what he perceived as clandestine hints of her growing attraction to him. Her slight touches of his hands and back as she paced the room like a tigress while the students labored over exams only solidified this belief in James. James always scored perfectly on his French exams, and even garnered the maximum bonus points that were sometimes proffered in class. These were a direct reciprocal of the rest of his life outside this particular classroom. His university life was a continuation of his mediocrity. Women did not respond to him. Men mocked him. Friends were difficult to come by. He barely scraped by with C's in most of his courses. His love of Sonic inspired him to become a fittingly middle-of-the-road fry cook there, continually being threatened with being fired if he did not hurry the hell up. During his senior year of high school, his parents split up. The royal blue 69 Camaro covered in dings, dents, and pockmarks his father had been planning to give him at his upcoming graduation was no more than a heap of scrap metal and rotting flesh after the 1102 train going east. The train passed by James's childhood home his entire youthful life, and had woken him nightly until he moved into the dorms. He would have never guessed that it would be his daddy's way out. A shotgun seemed more appropriate. James's choice would be pills. But that was in the past now. James's life would continue to be uninspiring, though he did what would seem to most people to be remarkable things and have remarkable opportunities and experiences. He traveled the world. Manila, Jakarta, Bangkok, Sydney, Perth, Cairo, Beijing, Phnom Penh, Tehran, and the list goes on and on and on and on. These experiences began as miniature missionary excursions with his local church back in high school. But they continued as he became quite the expert at finding cheap airfare and flimsy, though legitimate, reasons to visit far-flung places. All this travel highlighted an affinity for languages, though his true linguistic talents were restricted to good old Francais. Moreover, his mediocre bass guitar playing landed him a great many gigs around his home state, and those gigs landed him more gigs. And those gigs saw him playing some relatively large venues. This was the closest to cool that James could ever claim he is, maybe ever would be. That is, until those signals from Professor Lucius began to increase in frequency and intensity. He'd had an extraordinarily attractive earth science teacher in 9th grade that had been fired for an affair with a junior high student. A junior high student. In that class, James had thought he felt that vibe from the teacher toward himself and his other football-playing classmates. Many an afternoon was spent by the fitter boys being asked to stay back and assist with various doings in the young teacher's classroom. Still, such an interaction seemed utterly implausible and, in all honesty, just plain gross, not to mention illegal and maybe immoral. As it turned out, James's mediocrity was matched in Professor Lucius's, in a way. She'd been working on her PhD for roughly 8 years, which is not terrible in and of itself, until you found out that the program was a 3-year program. Ouch. James found this out when he attended an extra study session one afternoon. Dr. L was pretty free with the information when it was just the two of them. Dr. L was his version of Madame B for this new French instructor. He could tell that she liked the doctor title despite that stalled PhD of hers. She would giggle, not laugh, but giggle, almost every time James used that honorary title, though that giggle was a bit more reserved when his peers or her colleagues were around. James began going to Professor Lucius's free Tuesday night yoga sessions. She was apparently a yogi of sorts and had a little studio in the old pre-fire downtown area of the university's adjoining quaint little town. He thought yoga was a bit froofy for him, but she gave 10 bonus points for every 3 sessions her students attended, not that he needed them. The first session was strange. It had everything he expected: odd spiritualism, incense burning, a Ganesh statue, low lighting, lots of unnecessarily tight and or revealing clothing. He stretched and focused to the best of his ability. But he was surprised at how difficult a time he had with the different positions. Even so, he grit down and bore the discomfort and unfamiliar feelings in his muscles. Dr. L went so far as to commend him for how well he was doing, and she did so in front of the entire group. He was quite happy, though a bit surprised that she put her hands on him. A lot. Throughout the session to help him further get into the various poses. Of course, it was entirely professional. Still, the challenging new contortions and pushes for his body put together with his growing infatuation with the woman had his heart jackhammering and his body drenched in sweat. This went well beyond the small, faint touches of his hand and back in class. By the time they got to the relaxation portion of the end, well, he was exhausted. When he awoke to people quietly rolling their mats and exiting the studio, he couldn't believe he'd slept for at least 15 minutes, probably more. He'd have to reconsider whether he liked yoga or not after all. The only disappointment in that session, and consequently in every subsequent session that he attended, and there were numerous other sessions with the doc, came from James's misreading of the situation. Despite all the signals he got on campus via the, albeit surreptitious flirting, and during yoga with all the overt touching that went far beyond anything Dr. L did with anyone else, nothing happened in the dark as he was getting his things together to leave. Not that first night, nor any of the other free Tuesday night sessions she held for students. James was pleased that the flirting did become more overt, and the touching never decreased in frequency. After 4 joyous and thoroughly edifying years with Dr. L., James earned his degree and was set to move on. He took a summer job in Los Angeles, California. He worked with a French language camp on UCLA campus. This saw him travel all over the West Coast with a great many rich young teens. It was exciting, if not financially lucrative. While on UCLA campus, he went by a job fair that was open to the entire UCLA community, summer workers and attendees included. There, he saw a booth for the FBI, stopped by, chewed some fat with a rather jovial agent, and signed up for more information. 2 months of mediocre work for the language camp later, James had his final interview with the FBI at one of their California field offices there outside of LA. His even-keeledness, coupled with his enviable skills in French, seemed to truly impress the FBI, and he was soon set to head off to train at their Quantico facility. Co-workers, family, friends, and pretty much everyone that had ever known James were blown away that boring, unimpressive, vanilla James was off to work for the FBI. He was going to be some super secret government agent. It was almost inconceivable. Training went well, particularly because he was not a showboat. The trainers chewed up and spit out showboats for breakfast. Their words, not his. He excelled. His French continued to launch him ever forward. He wondered if he should reach out to Dr. L again. She never seemed to respond too terribly quickly anymore. He wondered if he just had this effect on all women. He graduated with honors. His family was proud. The rest of the world took no real notice. James's first assignment was in the République des Seychelles. Apparently, some real troubles were brewing in that francophone nation, so off he went. The unicameral Seychellois parliament had been compromised. The Supreme Court had been all but disbanded, and the president seemed more interested in chasing women than pushing to resolve what was shaping up to be a potentially country-ending constitutional crisis. Why did James get such a big job? Because it wasn't that big of a job, of course. The small African country just wasn't too terribly high on the U.S. government's priority list. A smattering of islands just didn't matter to U.S. strategic interests. At least, for now, anyway. He took a military transport plane and a couple small puddle jumpers to get to Victoria, the capital. He was assigned a pretty great office by the sitting president. He made many friends quickly. Unlike the rest of his life, James stood out pretty starkly here. He was far from ordinary. It made him feel ambitious, sexy, dangerous. He started going by Jim. That's right. Jim. The Seychellois women paid him a great deal of attention. He learned that he loved Indian food. He learned that he loved African food. He learned that he could pick up the local Creole languages rather easily. The president continued to chip away at democracy while the rest of the government seemed to sit by and be A-okay with this happening. Jim's only job was to bear witness and report back. The Seychellois president knew this, and he was just fine with that. No big deal. After only 9 months of falling in love with this nation, befriending most of the legislators and high judges, betting an untold number of women and having them care back for him for the first time in his life, Jim chose a November evening to assassinate the president. The legislature, the Supreme Court, and the limited military and police forces were already behind this action. So too were a great many foreign investors, the lifeblood of the tourism industry. Jim was acclaimed the dictator in perpetuity. He kept the democratic arms of the people in place, though, and he ditched that dirty D-word title. President for life? Sure. Do everything needed of a governmental apparatus by himself? No way, no chance. He had more adventures ahead of him, and that would seam him in far too tightly. As it turned out, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, hell, the U.S. President herself, all were elated by his actions. He thought he'd be denounced and have to watch his back for the remainder of his days, but no. Unremarkable James would be an easy puppet for them to handle. An ally that would be utterly loyal, creating an alliance that was utterly unassailable. Jim giggled when Madam President praised him and essentially said as much. They could not believe their luck. But they didn't know. They were thinking of James. They hadn't yet met Jim. Thank you for listening to Jim. The backing tracks for this story were taken from Muse Open at museopen.org. Muse Open is a 501c3 nonprofit focused on increasing access to music by creating free resources and educational materials. They provide recordings, sheet music, and textbooks to the public for free without copyright restrictions. As they say, their mission is to set music free. The first piece heard here was 12 variations on a French nursery theme, and the second piece was Fantasia in C minor. Both works are by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Stefano Ligorati is performing both. The first piece is being used under a Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 unported license, and the second piece is being used under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial 3.0 unported license. A sincere thank you to museopen.org and Mr. Ligorati for providing access to such great music. That does it for this week's episode of Prose. I do so very much hope that you enjoyed the selections this week. Prose will be coming to you from on the road yet again next week. This time, sunny St. Petersburg, Florida will be the remote casting home of the podcast. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to Prose. And keep your eyes peeled for next week's episode, rife with sunshine from the Sunshine State. Until next time, farewell.